program, because what Bradley Tusk, hi Henry, what Bradley Tusk is going to talk about is something that Citizens Union has been working on for years, which is getting more people to vote, make it easier for them to vote. And this is something that Bradley is not only talks a lot about, but he puts his money where his mouth is. And that's a really unusual thing in the world. So you're very lucky to have John Avalon, our wonderful board member, and you're the anchor of CNN Morning.
No. I'm senior political analyst and anchor, and I do my reality check shows. So yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right. Good morning, and no more from me. Take it away, boys.
All right. Thanks, Bradley. Good to see you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
No, I'm all mic'd up. So this is great. I've interviewed before. I've read your book.
Thank you. New one coming out in November.
Oh, really?
Plug it. Novel.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's fun.
Yeah, really.
All right, we'll nerd out on that later. Yeah. But you've been very involved, obviously, in the politics and civics life of the city.
Yep.
And stayed involved in private business in ways that are pretty impactful. But just framing the conversation, as Betsy said, one of the things that you and I talked about years ago, you were an early sort of advocate of mobile voting.
Yep.
And I think we, writ large, shared this idea that we need to lower the barriers to access, increase participation. But since you first sort of started floating this idea, obviously, we've been dealing with election denialism.
Yep.
And a deep-seated, baseless skepticism pushed by a particular person.
Yep.
To delegitimize voting. So how do you address those concerns with mobile voting where there's no paper record?
Yeah, well, two things. So one is there is a paper record. So it prints the system that we are building right now that will roll out in September. And again, it's technology that will be free and open source to any government, anybody that wants to use it outside of my foundation. It's not a business thing at all. It does ultimately, the ballot prints once it hits the election office. So it is a paper. There is a paper copy of it. But
that people can do a one-for-one.
Yeah.
But, guys, can you start by explaining what mobile voting
Yeah, sure.
That's fair. That's fair.
So
Sorry.
let me take half a step back. So I spent the first 15 years of my career in government and politics. I worked in city government. I was Mike's campaign manager. I worked for Mid-City Hall. I was at the Parks Department. Worked for Christine. Was the deputy governor of Illinois for 4 years. Was Chuck's communications director for a couple of years.
Wait. Which governor?
A guy who ended up getting a little bit of infamy named Rob Vukovic. But I never got indicted, so I'm pretty happy.
There you go.
I think at this point.
No, I think we're.
Yeah, now I have really good lawyers. The thing that I took away from it, and this little piece of paper I think kind of encapsulates it, is every policy output is the result of a political input. I believe that 99.9% of politicians, and apologies to former elected officials in this room, are desperately insecure, self-loathing people that can't live out the validation of holding office. And every decision they make, every 100% of the time, is solely based on the next election and nothing else. And the difference is, I accept this about them. I think this is human nature. I think this was probably true in the Greek Senate. I think this was probably true in the Roman Senate. It's not going to change. If human nature were able to change, we wouldn't have schools getting shot up constantly. So the thought I have is, if you want politicians to do something that you think is right, it has to be in their political interest to do so. You have to shift the inputs to get to different outputs. In the kind of 2011 to 2014, 15 range, I ran all the campaigns around the U.S. to legalize Uber and ride sharing. And the way that we won, and we beat at the time, we were like a tiny little tech startup, and taxi was a pretty muscular industry. They're not anymore, but they were before we got started. And the way that we beat them is we were able to mobilize our customers through the app. And millions of people around the country ultimately weighed in with their city council member, mayor, state senator, governor, whoever the relevant person was, to say, I want this thing, don't take it away. And we changed the input. So you're a member of the Tulsa City Council, and the taxi guys give you $3,000 each cycle. Okay, all things being equal, you're going to do what they want because you want the $3,000 for your next campaign. I just had 3,000 of your constituents email, tweet, call, text. Input shifts dramatically. Now you don't want to piss those people off. Leave it alone. And that worked in every single market in this country. And so when that happened, the thought I had was like, wow, these are people who are probably not, super prime voters, right? These are not people who are voting in city council primaries, state senate primaries. They might vote for president and think that they're regular voters, but they're generally not. And before that happened, my thought was, well, they're just too apathetic to do anything. And then after Uber, I'm like, well, they're not too apathetic. they'll do it if there's a good enough argument and if it's convenient enough. And so the thought was, well, what if we could vote this way on our phones? And so then as both blockchain and cloud technology improved over the years, it went from this kind of wouldn't it be cool to, hey, let's test it out. So in 2018, the first mobile voting election ever happened. It was in the state of West Virginia, and they made it available to deployed military from 2 different counties. And they were able to vote in real elections on their phone over the blockchain. We paid for all of the costs.
Sorry,
Yeah.
slow down right there and let's focus on that. Let's just talk about the mechanics. So it's literally mobile voting on your phone.
Yeah.
The security is achieved through blockchain.
Actually, so the system that we're building now is not a blockchain-based system. It's a fully encrypted system. So it's a lot like an absentee ballot, right? You get it, but instead of getting it on a piece of paper, you're getting it on your phone. Whatever the jurisdiction's security requirements are, that's what it complies with. There's multi-factor authentication to make sure that you are you, and it's your device. You cast your ballot, you look at it, you confirm that it's how you want to vote. You hit send or submit. It's encrypted. It goes to the election office. It's decrypted offline and then printed out automatically. And you can track your ballot all the way through so that you can confirm that it reached the election office, that it was submitted, printed, everything else. And so, look, I just spent $10 million of my own money to build this technology. It is something we drew out of my foundation. I'm going to give it away to anybody who wants it. And I believe that if we don't radically expand turnout, we are going to live in a world that is not even going to be one country in 25 years. So look, and this is a really knowledgeable room, if every election is basically decided in the primary, because 99% of elections are gerrymandered, and primary turnout is typically 10 to 15%, 10 to 15% of the voters are picking not just the elected officials, but all of their policies, because their policies are based on the next election. And so who are those people? The far left, the far right, and what do they want? They want moral purity, right? They don't want compromise, consensus. My brother-in-law happens to be a member of the House, and he's one of the few Democrats actually works with the Republicans. And my sister's house gets picketed by the DSA all the time.
Who's your brother-in-law?
Josh Gottheimer.
Oh, Gottheimer.
Because he dares to talk to Kevin McCarthy.
Yep.
How could he do something so abominable? And so they have no incentive to try to work together and get things done. And what that does is it leads to a total lack of faith in the system, because one of 2 things happen: either nothing, and we can't solve big problems, or the laws that we have are crazy, right, on one side or the other. And as a result, people lose faith in the system. And I think we're hitting a point where if you told me in 20 years we're not one country anymore because people made an almost logical decision of, you know what, we can't get anything done, we can't agree, we can't get along, we should get divorced, I think that could happen. I think the only thing that could prevent that from happening is changing the inputs. The only way to change the inputs is massively higher primary turnout. And the only way to do that is by letting people securely vote on their phones.
Okay, so there's a lot there, and I'm not going to go the second Civil War route because we could spend a lot of time there. I will say there are constitutional impediments to Marjorie Taylor Greene's national divorce scenario. But let's just talk about the mechanics. So first of all, it has to comply with state law. So you're saying that this is a
Yeah, I'm not. Look, there's a lot of people working on what the rules should be in order to be able to vote in any given state. That's above my pay grade, right? So whatever they are in any given state, we will comply with that.
Fine. And why is the encrypted process less hackable than the blockchain?
Because blockchain just wasn't necessary. Like I run a venture capital fund. It's my day job, and we do have investments in the crypto space and in blockchain. And I believe in blockchain as a useful tool to do things. But at the same time, it's plumbing, right? And either you need copper pipes or you don't. We didn't need this kind of pipe. And so encrypted, the reason it's so important is, one, it can't get from point A to point B with someone be able to see it. But 2, more importantly, if Putin did hack your ballot, he can't replace it. He can't replace Betsy with me on the ballot. All he could do is spoil the ballot, which then we get an immediate notification knowing that. So the encryption protects it from being tampered with, changed, and then allows us to know immediately if something happens. And just keep in mind, we have done 21 elections so far with the old tech that wasn't nearly as good as what we're about to put out there, where either deployed military or people with disabilities have voted in elections in 7 different states, some left-wing like Oregon and Washington, some right-wing like South Carolina and Utah. In real elections, they've all been audited by the National Cybersecurity Center, all come back clean. Turnout on average has more than doubled. So it's already happening and it already works.
So, and I think, one of this new version you're rolling out in September, you say, it does create the paper ballot backup, which I think is for some people, just the fail-safe thing. Related to increasing turnout is the question of open primaries.
Yeah.
Priority for a long time. How do you feel about that in the process?
I'm for it. And look, I've worked on, because I come out of the Bloomberg world, all this stuff, right?
Yeah.
I've worked on open primaries. I've worked on top 2. I've worked on redistricting reform. I've worked on ranked choice voting. I'm for all of it, but with apologies to anyone here who that's your sort of primary issue, it's at the margins, right? Because the problem we have is not that primary rules are too restrictive. The problem is on a random Tuesday, most people are not going to miss taking their kid to school or be late for work, whatever it is, to vote in the city council primary. It's not the rules, it's the accessibility. And if they have to go somewhere to do it, most of the time they're not going to. But if they can do it on the thing that they do everything else on, their banking, their healthcare, their love life, that they're staring at all day anyway, they'll do it. And we don't even need turnout to go from 12% to 93, going from 12 to 36. Let's take the Amazon HQ2 fight in Queens as a good example here. So Mike Generis, who's the guy that really led the fight to derail it, do you know what turnout was in the primary before the Amazon fight?
I guess 10%.
I think it was 9.
Okay.
So he was totally right politically that 9%, they genuinely hate Jeff Bezos, they genuinely hate Amazon. He would have been punished electorally if that 9% were the only people voting in his next election. So it gave him one of 2 choices: derail 25,000 jobs that we really needed, we're still down 400,000 jobs since COVID, or have a much wider primary turnout, right? You can't get a wider primary turnout through conventional means, even including open primaries, ranked choice voting, all of that stuff. The only way I think that you could get it is through mobile voting. So Janaris and Ron Kim and Jimmy Van Bramer and AOC and everyone else did what was in their political interest. I remember Cuomo came out and said, oh, they're all going to lose their next election. And I wrote my column for the Daily News saying, no, they're not. They're all going to win easily because they're doing the smart thing politically at the expense of the people, at the expense of the city. Yeah. They all won their re-elections with over 70% in the primaries. But if Mike Generis' turnout were 36 instead of 9, then just based on the polling in the district and in the city on that project, he would have been leading the fight for it, and we'd have those jobs right now.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, though, that open primaries would, I hear what you're saying about it's actually increasing them. The goal is to get to more representative elections. Yeah. If you have independent voters having access to vote for the candidate they like, that would have the same net effect.
I'm an independent. I can never vote in New York, right? My vote in New York is almost useless because I can't vote in the primaries. Yeah. And when I do vote in general election, but it's sort of pointless.
Most of the time.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about. I want to talk about tech and politics, but let's start with New York politics. So you were a big backer of Andrew Yang. Yep. Andrew's a guy who I like a lot, and I agree with him on a lot of policies. What were the lessons learned from that campaign for you, and how do you grade the Adams administration today?
2 things. So on the campaign, one is it just reinforced something that I already knew, which is the zeitgeist determines almost everything. Right. And so when Andrew started running, COVID recovery, that's the situation we were in. That's what everyone was thinking about, what everyone cared about. So a young, energetic, business-friendly person with private sector experience made sense as someone that could lead us out of this. Once the vaccines came out that March, all of a sudden, a lot of concern about COVID went way down because now all of a sudden people said, okay, I am safe. And at the same time, in part because of COVID, crime and violence started rising quite a bit. The zeitgeist switched from COVID to crime, and then Andrew went from the perfect candidate to not at all a great candidate. And Eric Adams, who had been a cop for 23 years, became the ideal candidate. So one is the zeitgeist is a lot of it. And 2 is, look, it just reinforced my belief in mobile voting because turnout was something like, I don't think it even cracked 15%.
That's
so it was not representative of the city as a whole, of the taxpayers as a whole. And look, it's on the people who didn't show up to vote, right? It's your choice. But at the same time, it reinforced to me that we need a system that could have dramatically higher turnout. I do think that ranked choice voting, though, by the way, was a successful reform.
Despite the Board of Elections, yeah.
Well, yeah, they're idiots. But I was about to say apologies to anyone from the Board of Elections, but no apologies. You deserve it.
No.
So that's what I learned. Look, I think Adams is doing pretty well. I think he's focused appropriately on crime. I think crime is down a little bit. Where I have concerns is you can't run a city with one person, right? So he is, in my view, really smart, really talented, cares a lot about the job, works really hard. I would give him like absolute flying passing marks on all that stuff. But the thing that Mike Bloomberg did, in my view, that made him such a successful mayor is not any one thing. It's not 311 or the High Line or the campus in Roosevelt Island or whatever it is. It's that he hired thousands and thousands of people into city government, like you and me, like everyone in this room, without any regard to anything but talent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Didn't care about politics, didn't care about party, didn't care about patronage. And then he made every commissioner, every deputy mayor, everyone else hire the same way. And so a level of influx of talent came into the city, into the administration, so that when I was at City Hall, I could have some half-baked idea that was kind of interesting. But then the good thing was the Department of Buildings could actually implement it because someone even smarter than me was sitting at DOB working on this stuff. I don't know that Eric has been able to attract that level of talent across the entire city bureaucracy. But the reason that I backed Yang was I felt like the most important thing the mayor can do is really attract that kind of talent. And Andrew, because of his personality, in my view, had the ability to do that.
That's interesting.
So I feel like if there's something for Eric to work on, and it's not necessarily, I mean, the people around him in City Hall might be fine, but it's not one person or 30 people, it's 3,000 people.
That's interesting. I think that's right about like a team and attracting talent. All right. You have actually a great blog post for distilling your 10 rules of politics. And I want to dovetail that with the effort you've made in New York, but also 24 states to increase free lunches through which is obviously a very impressive track record. Dig into that process, but also what the lessons learned from your principles of politics for good government.
Yeah, I actually have a good story that hasn't been told publicly yet. So,
oh, wow.
Breaking news.
Break some news.
Yeah,
Let's
exactly.
go.
So I've always been interested in hunger stuff, and since I was a freshman in college, I volunteered at Kitchens and Meals on Wheels. But I didn't grow up with a lot of money, and then I worked in government. I never made any money, and then all of a sudden I started my first company, started making money, started giving checks to the food bank, and the bigger the check, the more they kind of pay attention to you because they want even bigger checks. And so I kind of get on the inside a little bit, and it's sort of in some ways the worst thing they ever could have done because I got a firsthand view of their political operation, and my analysis was, this is terrible. These are lovely people, but they are terrible politics. So the question we asked is, what if you could run hunger campaigns, issues that are not that controversial, but at the same time, there's no great constituency really pushing for them that has a lot of political power. And if you gave it a true political sophistication, true resources, lobbyists, polling, PR, ads, all the stuff that you would see McDonald's or Walmart or CVS or whoever deploy, and people running the campaigns who really understand politics, could you get to better results? And so we made that one of the issues of my foundation, Tusk Philanthropies. We have run and funded campaigns in 24 states, like you said. We passed bills in 20 of them now. 12 million more people have access to food than didn't before. And most interestingly, about $5 million of my money has unlocked about $1.5 billion a year in new government spending on hunger programs. And so I think we found one of those rare issues where, it wasn't that it couldn't move because it was so controversial. It didn't move because the political skill wasn't there. And once we provided the political skill, we were able to really move it. And the nice thing is we've shifted our focus completely to universal school meals. We will pass it in Vermont this week. New York did an expansion, about 294,000 more kids now have it, thanks to the legislature and the governor a couple of weeks ago. But other states are doing it even without us now. So North Dakota, there was progress. New Mexico, there was progress. Michigan, there's progress. So it feels like maybe there's now starting to be a bit of a movement beyond just campaigns that I fund and run, myself and with my team. So I think over the next couple of years, if we push really hard, we have the ability to maybe enact universal school meals in 30 to 40 states. There'll probably always be 10 super red states that are just going to be really tough to crack. Like right now this year, we're doing New York successful, Connecticut. We got the first part done, which was an emergency extension. We don't have the second part done yet. Vermont will be successful. Oklahoma, which won't be universal, but it increases the income level to 250% of the federal poverty level. I think we'll win that one. But then North Carolina, that's dead. like it's a total waste of money.
That's ridiculous.
And so I don't know that we can ever get to 50, but I think that there's enough momentum now that we could maybe get to 35, 40 in a couple of years.
Aside from the re-gerrymandering of North Carolina, there's no reason politically that state couldn't.
No, it should be. And by the way, I did a poll in North Carolina. Like, not shockingly, 87% of Republicans supported school meals, right? And we showed this to all the legislators, and they understood it. They're not stupid, but at the same time, the people who supported it are not typically primary voters in state senate elections, and as a result, they don't matter.
Yeah, and I think that's key takeaways. The key takeaway, and it's the blog post y'all put in front of you is a good distillation of, I think, a lot of sort of real politics on a
15 years in city, state, and federal politics, and that's what I learned.
All right, so you do Section 230.
Yep.
It's getting a little wonky, but something that you basically it's a vestige of a 1990s bill that
Yeah.
the platform owners used to shield themselves for content. Now, I've been of the amend it, not end it school.
Okay.
But based on Francis Haugen's testimony, the
Yeah.
Facebook whistleblower. But tell me your prescription and why, given the fact that there did seem to be bipartisan support for reform, you think it's stalled and what can be done? What should
Yeah, so a few things. So Section 230 was part of a law passed in 1996 called the Telecommunications Decency Act. And what it did is it said an internet platform cannot be sued based on the content posted by a user. And it was a really important law at the time to birth the internet.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what we conceived of in 1996 and what we have today in 2023
A little bit different?
are a little bit different, right? So when Fox just had to pay almost $800 million to Dominion.
Hello, Fox. You want to wave to him over there?
They were
Hey, guys.
they were liable for their content, but if Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, which also took all of that information and certainly through the algorithms promoted it like crazy, they're untouchable. And so now we have this incredibly toxic internet with really perverse incentives. If you are a platform, you make your money through all advertising businesses. You make your money through advertising. And sadly, the way human nature works, negative content, toxic content generates a lot more eyeballs and a lot more clicks than positive. So there's in your economic interest to have negative content. The only reason you will change that, again, it's sort of like politicians, not because it's the right thing to do. They don't care what the right thing is. It's because it ceases to be in your economic interest. Right now, they're protected from any liability, so they have no reason to do anything other than what they're doing right now, which is to allow groups on Instagram that teach young girls how to cut themselves or how to develop eating disorders. I have a teenage daughter. I've been through a lot of this. I mean, horrific isn't even the right word to describe it. You have to change the inputs, right? And if you were to revoke Section 230 and take away their legal protection, their immunity, what you would see is the plaintiffs bar rush in with floods of lawsuits. Most would fail, but some would succeed. And over a period of years, jurisprudence would emerge that says these are the rules around content moderation. And you would see YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, whoever, taking them seriously because now they're more at risk in terms of judgments than they make in terms of the upside of negative content. And so I just think they're a lot like politicians. We got to change the inputs.
Yeah, I agree with the input approach, certainly. And there's a whole disinformation economy around programmatic advertising that is a related problem. I want to get to questions pretty soon, but I have a couple more for you. Let's go big for a second, tech and politics.
Yeah.
How do you think AI is going to impact politics?
It's a great question. I think it sort of depends, honestly, on what system we're having, right? Right now, we have this incredibly closed system. To your point, you can't vote in a primary unless you're a member of that party. You have to go somewhere on a random Tuesday to vote, all those things. For as long as they keep it as restrictive as possible. So what we saw in Texas, what we saw in Georgia is the norm, then I'm not sure anything's going to impact it all that much because the people who control the system have such a tight grip on it. I don't think AI might change the way people think about politicians or how what they tell a pollster they would do, but they're still not going to show up most of the time, right? So I think that AI has the potential to be helpful in politics, but only if we enable people to vote in the first place. And look, is there a risk of misinformation through AI? Absolutely. In fact, one of the reasons why I think Section 230's repeal is so important is because of AI, right? Which is, I want Facebook to have to be able to say, this is human generated, this is computer generated, right? Because if they don't have to do that, then they're going to do whatever makes sort of gets them the most clicks and eyeballs, and then misinformation is going to flow. If they are legally liable for determining the difference, they will do so accurately, and for the things that they can't tell, they just won't let it post, right? And so I think that AI, will have an impact. But one thing about AI, kind of like blockchain earlier, which is, I see this in my portfolio companies, and as a venture capitalist, for every one deal we do, we look at 100. Most new companies today are using some sort of AI tool in some way, but they're not AI companies. They're healthcare companies, they're fintech companies, they're transportation companies. Like, for example, we led the Series A of a New York City-based company called Elaborate Health a few months ago. They take your lab results and, instead, like, the doctor sends it to you, and then you're Googling like glucose 0.012, is that good or bad? And like, you have no idea what it means. It uses AI to interpret your lab results and show you through simple language, infographics, everything else. Here's the situation, here's what's going on, here's what's normal, here's what's not normal, which then also saves the doctors a ton of time, because some people then call the doctor and say, I don't understand this, and the doctor has to call them back and explain it. You get rid of all of that right now. Now, Elaborate is not an AI company. Elaborate is a healthcare company, but it's using AI as a tool. And so I think, just because of the way that media works, we get focused on one topic and everything becomes about that one thing. AI is very much a real thing, but I think it's much less ChatGPT and its own individual products, and it's just much more like blockchain, a tool for companies to develop products.
But basically, you think for you, it's remove Section 230 and a lot of those dangers.
Yeah, I think so. Because we have these platforms with such a death grip on the system right now, that the only good news about that is they control most of the viewing. So if they are now liable, their behavior will change it. Now, the other thing we need to do, I would argue, is break up a lot of these companies, right? As an early stage tech entrepreneur, as an early stage investor, I can't invest. I invest in seed and Series A companies. I can't invest in a potential competitor to Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Amazon, because they have so much monopolistic power. There's no way my company makes it through the process, right? It gets squashed at some point, and then my investment goes to zero. So I think that in the name of innovation, because all companies eventually get stagnant, if we want to have an economy that's constantly changing and evolving and innovating, we need to let younger companies have the ability to compete. They can't do so with the common monopolistic power that Meta or Microsoft has right now. In fact, Lena Khan, who's the chair of the FTC, I'm doing an event with her at my bookstore called P&T Knitwear on Orchard Street, June 1st, to talk about this. It's open to the public, so if you're interested in this stuff, come on by. Did you know I have a bookstore?
I didn't know.
So I opened a bookstore about a year ago. It's called P&T Knitwear. It's at 180 Orchard Street between Houston and Stanton. It is an indie bookstore. It's a podcast studio. It's the only one in New York that's free for anyone to use. It's an event space that's free to the community or the publishing community, and it's a lot of fun. I mean, it's like lighting money on fire, but it's it's a lot of fun.
Well, God bless you for opening a bookstore. All right, let's see what time we got. I think we got time for a few questions at least. Oh, we're gonna.
Okay.
Mike, I'm sorry.
Switch your handheld. Got it. Thanks.
All right, let's start with you.
Yeah, Bradley, on the first points on zeitgeist, mobile voting, and so on.
Yeah.
Mobile, just to be devil's advocate, mobile contributes to atomization and scatter, and it's the sense of group, of herd, of the electorate voting together that's getting lost. And won't this push it further and further away from that? You're talking about national unity and divorce and all of that.
Yeah, but they don't. I mean, sure, in theory, absolutely. But when city council turnout in primaries is 9%, there is what you're talking about doesn't actually exist in reality. And so, sure, look, if people were voting at a regular clip in all elections, we wouldn't need mobile voting, but they're not. And the failure of them to do so is what leads to all the polarization dysfunction that is pretty much, I think, destroying this country. And so, sure, in theory, that would be great, but the reality is completely the opposite, and we've got to address the reality.
Yes, sir.
Good morning. Two quick questions. Well, first is a quick one. Only you have to ingest, Bradley. When do you sleep? Okay. In almost 50 years, you've done amazing things. So thank you for what you're doing. The other quick question, I'll go to a more substantive one. You mentioned that all politicians care about is getting reelected. And okay, Mayor Mike, was he different?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes and no. So yes, now I'm gonna get myself in trouble. Absolutely different. Here's where he was different. Here's where he wasn't. Where he was different, and Christine can relate to this a lot, would be occasionally Howard or Kevin, these are Bloomberg people, and I would say to Mike, you need to be for this. You need to say that. Usually he would just ignore us. Sometimes we could make him do it. When he did it, he almost like inevitably, but I think on some level deliberately, fucked up the delivery of whatever it was we were trying to get him to say because he was so resentful that we were trying to get him to say something he didn't actually believe in. So that's true. On the other hand, we did change the long-term limits, right? I'm literally the guy that ran the bill to do it. And so, we're not totally pure either.
All right, now the substantive part, okay? On the topic of national unity, polarization, everyone knows the problem. One of the solutions, and one that I'm trying to push with my PhD dissertation, is universal national service, so that there's a shared experience, yada, yada, yada. You take the opportunity to teach civics within, whether it's military or other national service. And I'm curious about your thoughts, and I'd like to speak to you more about it offline.
Sure. So, yeah, I think it's a great idea. In a way, because of the nature of warfare has changed, there's just no need for as much military service or draft or anything like that. And I think that creates a deficit in many ways. So like my father immigrated to this country in the 1950s. Vietnam came and he enlisted in the Navy because he wanted to serve his country. And I think he lived, obviously, wouldn't work out well if he didn't, but he sees it as a defining thing in his life that he's very proud of, right? And that he was able to, and he still is friends with his Navy buddies. In fact, when we had the bookstore opening a year ago, a couple of guys flew in from around the country to attend the bookstore opening. And so totally agree with it. I think that, there's this concept of gap years where students go from, instead of going, like I could see my daughter maybe after 12th grade taking a year before she starts college. That could certainly be a natural inflection point for something like that. And I think even more broadly, I kind of wonder if we're teaching the right things in schools, meaning, so for example, I spent some time last summer studying something called dialectical behavioral therapy, and it's an entirely different way for people to respond to anxiety, respond to crisis, approach other people, everything else. I'm pretty convinced that if everyone in school learned that instead of Spanish or French or whatever it is, you'd have a vastly more peaceful, cooperative society. And so I think generally speaking, what you're talking about makes sense. And I think maybe even rethinking, like, what are the skills that are truly necessary to produce, happy, functional human beings, right? Because you know what? I took Spanish in 7th grade. I don't remember any of it. So that didn't do much for me. But the DBT training I did this summer, that's done a lot.
All right. Well, and more civics education, please. And by the way, Westmore's got a pilot program in Maryland that's very good. That's looking more decentralized, any form of service. It's very good. Cindy, yep.
Frankly, I'm not sure I want everybody to vote.
Oh,
I feel that, like most people want to vote for somebody that they want to have a beer with, that they like, instead of someone who's actually qualified, which we've seen in the past. So how do we develop critical thinking skills before I want everyone to vote?
Yeah, look, it's a fair question, although since we managed to elect both sort of people it'd be fun to have a beer with who stink and eggheads who stink, I think we managed to get it wrong on all sides. But what I would love to see ultimately is mobile voting be paired with education, right? So we're already getting all of our information on the internet already. I would love to see jurisdictions be able to say, we're going to combine this tool with abilities to really share with voters. Here's who the candidates are. Here are their beliefs. Here are their positions. Here's what they've, and all of that. So I think that while what we're building is specific to voting, one of the reasons I'm going to just put it on GitHub and make it open source is that so other coders can build on top of it and incorporate other things like that. Because the nirvana of sort of my dream would be everyone votes and they actually know what they're talking about. And I think it's at least theoretical through the internet to be able to do both.
Let me ask the question that I think that was going to ask before I interrupted, which is in an era of hyperpartisanship and voter suppression, how do you expect to get mobile voting passed?
Yeah, that's a great question, one that keeps me up at night quite a bit. So the first phase of what we did was sort of proof of concept, and those are the 21 elections in 7 different states, and what we mainly did was we funded all of the costs in all of those states. So instead of the taxpayers paying for it, I paid for it, and that kind of eliminated some of the risk and concern. Second piece was building the tech. We've talked about that. Third piece is the movement, right? At the end of the day, you're absolutely right. So if I said to Chuck, look, Chuck, you purport to believe in these 25 things. If we had mobile voting, they'd all be more likely to happen. You know what he would say to me? I'm not making it easier for AOC to primary me. And that would be the only way he would look at it, right? And so not only are the Republicans who are pushing kind of voter suppression laws going to oppose mobile voting, so will Democrats, so will unions, so will lobbyists, so will trade groups. So I'm going to need some version of the Arab Spring here in this country where my kids who are 16 and 14 and all of Gen Z to basically rise up and say, like, bullshit, we do everything on our phones. We know that this is a much safer system than what you're making us use right now. We won't accept it. And then in reality, it's going to shrink a lot over time. So, the very first question you asked about kind of changing views among the validity of elections, at least by Republicans, our polling shows that, right? So we did a poll, we got a couple of polls, but we did one pre-2020, and support for mobile voting was roughly 75%, kind of across the board, right? Pretty much as long as it's, now we did one, 6 months ago, stayed at 75 with the Democrats and independents. It was down to like 50 with Republicans because of all of the changes in the way that people view kind of the validity of elections and voting right now. So, there's a very long haul to get there. And let me just say, so I have self-funded this thing completely, and I've done okay, but I'm not that rich. And if anybody here would like to help me going forward, I would very gladly take the help.
Have you looked at starting with military and disabled solely,
Yeah, there's a bill in Albany, in fact, right now that would expand electronic balloting to military and disabled specifically. Other demographics, maybe people at nursing homes, people on Native American lands, people who are away at college. So yeah, the reason that I picked military and deployed military people with disabilities is who could object to that, right?
Right, exactly.
So, my sort of strategy, I guess I'm unveiling it here, maybe I shouldn't, but is to kind of circle around all of the sort of low-hanging fruit and then move our way into the middle.
Smart. Okay, what else? Oh, we got one or two more. Okay. That's you. Yes. Oh, you want a microphone? You can tell us. Barbaric, y'all.
So since we're not going to jump to mobile voting, what are the incremental changes that a legislature, which got elected under the current system, might be willing to accept to move along the process in other areas of voting?
Yeah, well, two things. So one, on mobile voting, it's going to be incremental, right? So it's going to be different groups get included, and then it'll start with municipal primaries or state primaries. It's going to be a while till everyone's voting in a federal presidential election on their phone. It's going to be very incremental. In terms of other stuff, look, you generally don't see open primaries passing in that many states. And when it does, it's usually a ballot measure, not legislation, because again, people who have power don't like to lose power, right? And that's been true throughout time. Other than George Washington and Pope Benedict, I can't think of anyone with a lot of power who's ever voluntarily stepped down. That just doesn't happen. And so generally speaking, you won't see a lot of it. There's some movement on ranked choice voting. There are some states that are considering, open primaries. But I think the combination of, that I think the impact is sort of at the margin simply because it still requires someone to go somewhere, and that's really a problem, combined with the fact that people in power don't want to do anything to make it easier to lose power. One of the reasons why I tried to put all of my effort and money behind mobile voting specifically is I kind of think that they're all really hard, and my thing may be a little harder, but I might as well invest in the one thing that's truly scalable.
Yeah, and presumably people won't want to go out of their way to alienate the disabled in the military community. So that's a good start. Okay, I think we're done. Okay, one more. All right, Eleanor.
So, sorry. Hi, how are you? So, you talked in great generalities. Can we just talk about one specific issue?
Yeah.
Let's talk about guns and
Sure.
the Second Amendment and how can we get beyond what we're seeing right now, especially in places?
Yeah, it's funny. I usually when I do the mobile voting shtick, I have a Republican example and a Democratic example. I use the Democratic one, Amazon, because we all live that here, but the Republican one is guns, right? So let's just say that you're a Republican congressman from Florida. Turnout in your primary is 12%.
It's a gerrymander. It's the only election that matters is the primary. NRA members are half that 12%. You know that it's crazy that someone could walk into a store and walk out with an AK-47, right? You'd have to literally be delusional not to think that. But you also know that if you were to support an assault weapon ban, you lose your next primary. Chris Jacobs, Republican from upstate New York, there was a massacre in a supermarket in Buffalo. He said maybe we ought to consider some restrictions. They stripped the line from him. He couldn't even run in the next election a few months later. And so, but in that same election, if turnout were 36% instead of 12, just based on all the polling that we see around assault weapons, you would shift your position simply because you want to win the next election. So when the NRA's vote share is 50% of your primary, you're never going to do it. When it's 12 or 16%, then you got to do it. And so I think that, guns to me is one of those issues that will never, ever change absent radically increased primary turnout on the Republican side.
All right. I like it. Are we at time? Oh, as long. I don't know where you were. All right, let's take two more. Let's take two more.
First of all, thank you very much. I think it's great what you're doing, and I think, because I'm optimistic, that at some point this will happen, whether in the near future or not so near future. But I mean, the fact is we live with these phones and electronic devices. Some of us have more problems with them than others, but certainly the new generation trusts them, likes them, and are committed to them. And I think so. I think it's going to happen, and I think going forward, it could even get fine-tuned so that after an election, people could be saying, "Okay, what are your thoughts about X, Y, and Z?" It could get down to politics and positions, and I think it could be really the way we run things, and I think it's very important.
I'm going to answer your question by saying something that's now going to make a couple people on my team over there get really upset when I say this, but you could see a world with a truly liquid democracy, right?
Exactly,
where you don't need legislators at all, right? And you just have people running things operationally, and everyone could make every decision solely based on their phone. Now that's far away, but is there a world where you could have a truly direct democracy where you vastly empower people in a way they don't have right now? Yeah. With that said, if I say that, it scares people away, so I'm not supposed to say it.
No, I think it's great. Thank you very much.
All right. Oh, okay. Christine gets to close it out.
We haven't talked about TikTok and the fear of TikTok
Yeah.
that a lot of the elected officials have.
Wait. Yep.
I'm just curious if you can address the current issue with TikTok and how some states are banning it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, look, the reason why you're at least seeing bipartisan support for various types of social media regulation. There's a bill that just got through Congress that would say no one under the age of 13 can use social media. I think parental consent up to 16 or 17. You saw President Biden support getting rid of Section 230 in the State of the Union address. This is one of those rare issues where everyone kind of agrees. If you're a parent, right, kind of regardless of your views on abortion or guns or any other issue, you kind of think, like, I'd like my kid to be better protected against this thing than they are right now. Look, TikTok is doing a very good job at communicating with kids, because my kids use it. I know that. But they're doing a really bad job politically. I mean, they should have hired you or me or someone to help them, because
Would you have taken?
I think that I thought about it because I did get asked to talk to them. If the ultimate resolution was the sale of TikTok to a U.S. company and it was facilitating that transaction, yes. If it was just status quo as is, no. But look, I mean, one thing that TikTok has not done, and it kind of amazes me, is what we did with Uber, what we did with FanDuel, what we did with Bird, what I do with so many of my portfolio companies, which is mobilize the customers, mobilize the users, right? They have tens and tens and tens of millions of people. A lot of them are teenagers, but a lot of them are adults too, who were fairly addicted to this content. And I think that they probably could shift some of the political inputs, but they have done a really bad job politically, other than some PR hits and some bad testimony for Congress. They haven't done much of anything. And so, again, what's the political input? If you're a member of Congress, parents are scared of this thing. If you talk about China, you sound smart. And so as a result, the natural place would be to sort of, in some way, support a TikTok ban or at least force the sale to U.S. companies. So I do think that will happen.
Interesting. Very interesting. Also, I'll take a little interview or privilege. You had an interesting on on regarding Twitter and the collapse of SVP and sort of run on banks via social media. I like this idea a lot.
Sure. So as a venture capitalist, I had a couple of really scary days when Silicon Valley Bank collapsed a few months ago. We, like every VC, have accounts at SVB, and even more important than our money, our portfolio companies had a lot of money there, and they probably would have gone out of business, and some of our better ones were in that situation. And so one thing that I was sort of wondering about was, you saw this unfold over a period of a couple of days, really on Twitter, right? And ultimately, there was some analytics done of this. Like Silicon Valley Bank had basically the equivalent of 0 mentions on Twitter and social media, and then it went to the highest thing on all the internet for a little while. And so the question I was asking is, the Fed's never able to monitor all these platforms. They don't have access to the analytics and the data to know, like, oh, something's clearly going on with SVB because it just shot up 3,047% in the last hour and a half. So what if you require the platforms to say, okay, here's a list of 500 financial institutions. When traffic about them spikes from A to B, you just have to let someone at the Fed know. Email this person, call this person, whatever it is. It would cost nothing to anybody. I don't think it imposes much of anything on anyone. And so Richie Torres has introduced that as legislation. He was on my podcast called Firewall a couple of weeks ago talking about it. And, look, I think some legislation will probably pass around SVB. And so my hope is that this will be included in the final bill.
I like it. All right, Bradley.
Thanks for your time.
Thanks for coming.